In 1848, my mother, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, began a human rights revolution with these words: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal." I was born 8 years later in the center of the rebellion, in a rollicking household of liberty-loving children. Not long after graduation from Vassar, I married an Englishman and, in so doing, lost my American citizenship, but not my love for this nation and the ideals of liberty and equality my mother and her friends proclaimed and defended in the Declaration of Sentiments. After Mother's death, I continued our fight with my focus on economic justice for working women, wage earners, and professionals. I rejected ladylike strategies and found more in common with the militant Alice Paul than with the conventional Carrie Chapman Catt of the National American Woman Suffrage Association. Instead of yearly conventions attended by the already converted, I planned spectacular suffrage parades and used new technology like radio and film to fight for suffrage. In 1920, after 72 years of effort, the 19th Amendment guaranteed the right to vote for American women. I should say, it guaranteed the privilege of voting to some American women. Poverty and racism kept large numbers of women away from the polls. Just as my mother and I had predicted, winning the vote, however glorious a victory, did not solve our problems. In 1923, my sometime ally and sometime rival in women's rights agitation decided it was time to write women's equality into the Constitution. She chose Seneca Falls, the birthplace of the women's rights movement, as the place to launch the Equal Rights Amendment. Seneca Falls is my birthplace too, so I was surprised to find that I was not invited. Maybe she didn't want to deal with my mother's radical reputation. Perhaps she didn't like that I did not believe a constitutional amendment would solve all our problems any more than suffrage did. Luckily, the people of Seneca Falls insisted upon my presence, and so I came. What a time we had. There were speeches, of course, and inspirational entertainment by Van Cleef Lake. There was an opera singer, and the girls of Seneca Falls danced in costumes as goddess-like figures. Then all the women from the National Woman's Party climbed into automobiles and drove to Rochester to pay their respects at Susan B. Anthony's grave. I must tell you that I was not very happy with Alice Paul. She ignored Elizabeth Cady Stanton's contributions in favor of Susan B. Anthony. As my brother Theo said, Susan B. Anthony had as much to do with the Declaration of Sentiments as the man on the moon. I also wasn't happy that she told me to keep my speech short. The nerve of that woman. The girls in Seneca Falls dressed as goddesses of truth and progress, but we suffragists were just people and prone to all of humanity's sins, conflicts, and jealousies. My mother had no patience with the idea that women are naturally more virtuous than men. Democracy is a flesh and blood affair, gritty and imperfect. We don't demand equality because we are better. We demand equality because we are human. It is important to note that the women of 1923 had our disagreements. It is more important to note that despite this, we worked together. Lucretia Mott was not sure at first that demanding the vote was wise. "Lizzie, they will make us ridiculous," she said. Then she rolled up her sleeves and worked for the right to vote for the rest of her life. I wasn't sure that an equal rights amendment would solve all of our problems, but I saw that it was a good start and a necessary step in our long journey to equality. Progress requires that people who disagree respect each other enough to work together. So yes, we must know when to compromise. We must also know when to refuse to compromise. 10 years before Alice Paul introduced the Equal Rights Amendment, she organized a magnificent parade, which would become known as the first civil rights parade in Washington, D.C. But under pressure from Southern white women, she asked Black women to march in the back. She thought she could justify the compromise, but it was a compromise she was willing to take with other people's freedom. Ida B. Wells and Mary Church Terrell, two of America's greatest human rights advocates, stood firm against this bargain with injustice. They and many other African American women marched boldly and proudly that day, side by side with white women. It is important to remember that. Remember that Black women like Ida B. Wells, Mary Church Terrell, Fannie Barrier Williams, and Frances Ellen Watkins Harper worked as hard and harder than white women for the right to vote, the right to equality. But Southern Black women had to wait until 1965, when the Voting Rights Act finally guaranteed the right to vote for African American citizens. Remember that Latina women like Jovita Adar and Adelina Otero Warren stood up for all of us, but many Latina voters had to wait until 1975, the year when the Voting Rights Act was amended to end discrimination against Spanish speakers. It is good to remember our history and to celebrate the thousands of women dressed in white who marched with their suffrage banners high. Remember the Black women who stood up to Alice Paul and refused to march at the back of the parade. Remember Mabel Ping-Hua Lee, a Chinese-American suffragist who led thousands of women in a mighty parade up Fifth Avenue. She carried the banner of freedom for all American women, but had to wait to vote until 1943, when the United States government recognized Asian Americans' full citizenship. Remember Zitkala Sa, a Dakota suffragist who demanded justice for First Nations women, whose voting rights were denied in many states until the 1950s, unless they agreed to give up their culture and language. All of these women and so many, many more are part of our women's rights story. I have only shared a few names of women from my own time, but each generation is rich with women's courage and tenacity. Back in 1923, I was nostalgic about Seneca Falls. I grew up there, but it belongs to all of us. I am proud of my mother's legacy, but my daughter and my granddaughters gave me hope. What I said to the girls and women of 1923, I say to you today. Those who take the first step are great. Those who take it and then follow it, never flagging step by step on to the goal are greatest. All hail to the loyalties of women to women. All hail to youth and its initiative. All hail. So in that spirit, I welcome you to Seneca Falls and thank you for the role you will play today during this Convention Day celebration. You are powerful. You are needed. And whatever your background, whatever your gifts, you are a part of this story. All hail the Seneca Falls Convention. All hail the Equal Rights Amendment. All hail the women who marched, taught, legislated, wrote, danced, preached, sang, and protested for human equality. All hail the women who answered the call. All hail the women who were told to march in the back but refused to back down. All hail the women who were not invited but showed up anyway. Banners held high, and eyes set on the still distant prize of freedom.